Okay. So, girls, since we didn't have class today, I was thinking about doing this anyway, and somebody had asked if I had a recording on this chapter, and I don't, but I certainly can make one so that we can just press on after this. And I don't know how far we got in this chapter, but this is just in general. If you need to skip ahead, you can skip ahead. But basically, we had said that the Gilded Age, is named such because it was almost like a facade that everyone had such prosperity because there were a few people that had a tremendous amount of prosperity and like what we call the robber barons, like the Rockefellers and the Morgan, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, Vanderbilt, people like that become incredibly wealthy during this time period because of the boom in industry, the boom in railroad building, and some of the different things that they're involved in, whether it's steel or the railroad or oil. Those are all things that became very much needed during the age of industrialization, which occurs at the same time here. We're going to see at the turn of the 20th century, as we get closer to it, that there is a second industrial revolution, and there aren't a lot of government regulations to prevent a person from forming a monopoly and sort of cornering the market. So what happens is industry grows faster than government can keep up with it in the Gilded Age, and there is a lot of unchecked power by individuals. And if you scratch the surface underneath, there's a lot of working poor people. It isn't all it isn't all wealth the way it might seem from a distance. So Mark Twain is the one who coins the phrase "the Gilded Age" in a book that he wrote called "The Gilded Age," and of course he is questioning the tremendous wealth of certain individuals. So during this time period, Grant becomes president. Of course, he uses his reputation as a war hero to win the election. That's what they mean by waving the bloody shirt, is what elects him. So he's saying, look, I was in the war. I'm a war hero. I was on the side that won. We were the good guys, and that does help him get elected. He is a better general than he is president. We'll see he has a couple scandals in his presidency that kind of tarnish his reputation. So he wins the election of 1868. Two examples of what we call robber barons, or guys who are barons of industry, who they call them robber barons because they feel like in some cases the public feels like it's illicit the way that they're becoming so wealthy. So some of these guys we talk about, we're going to call them robber barons. So robber as in stealing. A baron of industry is someone who's like a captain of industry, someone who's very well known in their field and kind of an expert in whatever it is, whether it's in the railroad or steel or banking or whatever. So Jim Fisk and Jay Gould were two guys who had a lot of money, and the point of this is it shows you how powerful some individual people are because of their wealth. And these two guys wanted to drive up the price of gold, so they bought so much of it that it did drive up the price of gold, just a lesson in supply and demand. And basically, the government had to sell all of their gold in its reserves to get the price back down again. So when you have people who are so powerful that they're manipulating the whole treasury, that is a concern. Okay, we talked about Tammany Hall before, and Boss Tweed is the head, or William Marcy Tweed is the head of Tammany Hall, and they're a political machine, which basically a political machine is a group of professional politicians that operate in a certain way that's almost like a well-oiled machine, but it's certainly not machinery, it's people. And a lot of times they use bribery, they use intimidation, they use kickbacks, they use different illicit means to get what they want. This is an example of there's a lot of like the spoil system, like patronage. They get a lot of graft from this, which graft, which is illicit money gotten through bribery and things like that. And people like Boss Tweed become very wealthy. And these guys are Democrats in New York. There's also a group of Republicans in New York who are just as illicit under this guy named Roscoe Conkling. So there's no, when it comes to patronage and it comes to crooked politicians, it doesn't just belong in one political party. You see it in both the Democrats and the Republicans during this time period. Okay, and Tweed does go to jail. His bookkeeper blows the whistle on him for his books that were just not making any sense because of all the bribes and everything that he had taken. And well, here's the word graft. And basically, Tweed gets caught by his bookkeeper, and he goes to jail and he escapes. And then from there he goes to Spain, and somebody in Spain recognized him from a Thomas Nast political cartoon, and he ends up getting recaptured and going back to jail, and he ends up dying in jail. All right, we're going to skip this. Just know that Grant has a second term. He wins again in 1872. Okay. All right. And he has two scandals. These are probably vocab words that you have. The Credit Mobilier scandal and the whiskey ring scandal are two big scandals during Grant's administration. And it's unknown whether or not Grant really knew about them or was involved. But either way, it makes him look bad because he was the president of the United States, and right under his nose, you have people who are doing these illicit things. And basically, the Credit Mobilier scandal was, the Credit Mobilier is a French company that had a bunch of stockholders, and they were presenting the taxpayers, the country, with the bid to build the Transcontinental Railroad, and they inflated the price of it by $20 million. And they said, okay, well, what do they know? People don't know how much it costs to build a railroad. We'll say it costs this, but it's only going to cost us that. And with the 20 million extra dollars, we'll just split it among all of us shareholders. And that's what they proceeded to do. And then they did get caught. And the whiskey ring scandal was, there's a tax on whiskey, and the government workers who were collecting the tax from the whiskey distillers told them, oh, don't worry about it. You don't really have to pay it, but just pay us and we'll keep our mouth shut. So both of these things went all the way up into Grant's top administration. One of them, I think the Credit Mobilier scandal, even the vice president knew about it. And the whiskey ring scandal, it was, I think, his private secretary. So, once again, even if Grant didn't know about it, it got that high up. That's pretty, either those people have no respect for him, or he's not doing a very efficient job that people can get away with doing stuff like that. So both of those things were pretty shady, and kind of tarnished Grant's reputation. And from there, he goes on to really struggle. He struggles in a lot of failed business endeavors, and he just has a hard time after his presidency financially, and this does hurt his reputation. Shockingly, over-speculation and the Panic of 1873. There's always over-speculation and panics. But again, people just, banks are over-lending. And when people don't pull in the money that they think they're going to make, either in business or in farming, you're going to see, some foreclosures and things like that. So the government was trying still to fix the money supply. I told you that's going to be something we're going to talk about for a long time. Because there were two different currencies during the war, and they're trying to recall some of the greenbacks that were in circulation and try and go back to metallic currency until they can figure it out. And they even push for the coinage of silver. And, that's something that we're going to talk about again too. But as I said, the money supply situation is going to be a problem for a little bit. And that's called contraction, which is pulling back those greenbacks and replacing them with hard money. So that hard money policy is using gold and silver. And that's actually going to cause economic problems for the Republicans, and eventually you're going to see more Democrats being voted into Congress. Okay, we talked about the Gilded Age. All right, so here, the people ask about this a lot, girls. This is a time period where Republicans start to make get the reputation that they have a high moral standard, and they feel that the government should play a role in regulating economic and moral affairs of people, where the Democrats don't. They have their own moral compass, whether it's the church. There was a lot of Catholics who were Democrats, and they maybe answer to a different moral code of conduct, and they aren't so worried about it coming from the government. They don't think the government should impose a single moral standard on society. And a lot more Democrats are in the South and in the northern industrial cities. So, you do see politics kind of switch over the years with different topics that come up, but these are their beliefs now in the Gilded Age as far as Republicans and Democrats. Okay. As I said, patronage, the spoils system belonged in both. It wasn't associated with only one party, and there's a lot of corruption on both sides of the aisle. Okay. Grant could have run again. There isn't anything that says you can't run until the 1950s. The 22nd Amendment says you can only have 2 terms, but that's not until after FDR. They don't put that in place until the 50s. So he could have run again, but he did not. Congress might have passed a resolution, but it doesn't become an amendment until later. So this was the thing, we've already talked about this, the election of 1876 with Samuel Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes. Hayes is going to be the Republican. He wins because they think it's like a backroom shady deal that was made because the electoral votes were disputed. They had 2 returns that they sent in, and they were inconsistent. So they weren't sure if the count was right. So and it was very slim, the margin. So the Southerners allegedly made a deal with the Republicans and said, we'll let your man win, meaning Rutherford B. Hayes, if you pull the rest of the troops out of the South and leave us alone. And that's what ends up happening. And that's why Reconstruction ends in 1877 with they call that the Compromise of 1877. And again, it's nothing they said in Congress and said out loud and signed a deal or anything. It's probably like a shady behind the scenes deal, but most historians believe that that's probably what went down. Okay. Because of that, they set up the Electoral Count Act, which was a bunch of people from both the House and the Senate and the Supreme Court as well, reviewing the count so that they wouldn't have these problems. Although, there is a problem. Again, we talked about the election of 2000 with George W. Bush and Al Gore, but that wasn't electoral counts. That was just the returns, the count in one state because of the punch card that they used in Florida. Anyway, that's what ends up happening with Rutherford B. Hayes. That's how he becomes president. So therefore, a lot of people, they called him Rutherfraud, and they made fun of him, and they said that he wasn't really elected, and that he was a fraudulent president and all this stuff. So of course, with every shady deal, there is always repercussions, and Rutherford B. Hayes was the Democrats had a field day with that, kind of saying he wasn't really truly the president, but he was. So anyway, the Republicans, if the radical Republicans would have had their way, a lot more would have been done with the Reconstruction. But once they pulled out of the South, they kind of gave up on taking over the South and fighting things like Jim Crow laws and whatnot. But once Plessy v. Ferguson happens in 1896, that makes segregation legal according to the federal government, so it's going to be very difficult to combat that. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 is not considered to be constitutional because it's not part of the amendment. It's not part of the Constitution, it's not an amendment. And eventually, the 14th Amendment we talked about is going to be constitutional. However, the court is going to say that the 14th Amendment speaks about the government violating your civil rights, not civil rights being violated by individuals. So, for example, in Plessy v. Ferguson, Homer Plessy is going to cite the 14th Amendment as his rights being violated. He cites the 14th Amendment, and the court says, well, we're not, the 14th Amendment doesn't have to do with social accommodations. It doesn't have to do with your civil rights being violated by the train car company. It's only if the government is violating it. So their interpretation in 1896 is a little disappointing for Homer Plessy. What's the difference? Who violates your civil rights? If they're being violated, they're being violated. So in 1896, that's how they view it. But fast forward to Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, and the court sees it differently then, and they say separate but equal is inherently unequal, and you can't separate people, and that is a violation of civil rights. So as time went on, the court changed their view, but it's 60 years of segregation because of the way they interpreted it earlier. Okay. Redeemers are people who try to go in and bring back the old South. Um, and they want to restore it back to the way it was before the war, where the white planter class is in control